Welcome to today's webinar on Ration Book, a least cost ration formulation program. Our presenter today is Tiffany Bennett, Livestock Consultant from PIRSA Rural Solutions. Today's webinar is brought to you by Sheep Connect South Australia. Sheep Connect South Australia is funded by the Australian Wool Innovation Limited and the South Australian Sheep Industry Fund. For more information on Sheep Connect SA, please refer to our website or follow us on Twitter. We would like to acknowledge the Coron Tatiara Lap for their ongoing support of Ration Book, which will be presented to you today by Tiffany Bennett.
Thanks, Ian. To give a bit of background on Ration Book, perhaps before we have a look at the program and how it works. Ration Book is a least cost sheep and cattle ration program that you can build rations for either supplementary feeding alongside pasture or full hand feeding. Just on the pasture, it is not designed for green feed. It is designed for dry feed situations or stubbles. Not designed or break of the season, but not designed for spring or pasture budgeting. No specialist knowledge is required to run the program, and there's a lot of systems in the background in place to ensure that rations are balanced and that minimum fibre requirements are met, protein, etc. At the end of the program, it generates a feed budget. And traditionally, feed budgets have been a difficult thing for producers to sit down and handwrite themselves. There's certainly now numerous programs and apps to support farmers in generating a feed budget, but this program does that also. You can, whilst the program has default feeds, the program has the ability to accept feed test data that you may have of feeds specific to your situation. And it also has the flexibility to put unusual feedstuffs in, whether you had a feed test on that or not, or figures for a feed that's not already in there. The program has the ability to accept those feeds. The program was previously known as Takeaway many years ago and was rebadged Ration Book. The program was developed back in 1995 by Adrian Barber, who's now retired at Keith in South Australia, under the Primary Industries and Regions SA. Just a few limitations on the program. I guess it does not allow for abnormal conditions such as extreme cold stress, walking long distances, perhaps such as in the pastoral zone or extreme hilly country where ME requirements may increase significantly. The program also does not account for all trace mineral requirements and deficiencies. It does have some mineral accountabilities in there, namely sodium, calcium and phosphorus, which we'll see a bit later. It also does not account for perhaps mineral contributions from water sources, and there are numerous water sources across the state with high sodium chloride levels, so it doesn't account for those. It doesn't add a mineral supplement or account for a mineral supplement in there that many people would use, a blanket mineral supplement that also probably perhaps has a buffer and some other coccidiostats and etc. in. It doesn't account for that, but you could still use those products within there rather than using limestone or the other additives that might put in there if you didn't have a product such like that to use. I think it's important that if you don't understand what your mineral challenges are, like in a fully supplied situation and you're using a mineral pellet, your deficiencies should be addressed in a fully supplied ration, but perhaps when a dry pasture component comes in, and particularly when that becomes a significant part of what they're eating, I think understanding your challenges or mineral contributions through testing water and pasture, blood or liver biopsies, whatever is best in your situation, should be explored, and talk to your animal advisor about going about that. In recent years, there's been a large focus on condition score rather than weight of an animal, which can then account for different frame sizes, etc. So I think using this program, whilst it doesn't account for condition score, if you know the condition score of your animals and whether they need to increase or maintain, or can allow for a slight weight loss, this program can then account for that, as providing you know the condition score of the target group that you're feeding. As I said probably earlier on, it's really important to realise that this program is for dry feed, no feed type situations, and is not a pasture growth modelling or supply tool. So there's other programs available to do that. This is filling quite a niche, and I guess for people in drought or bushfires, it's likely to be a fully supplied ration, which I guess this webinar today is targeted for. If we start maybe looking at the feedstuffs here, to the first tab, we start by looking at the feedstuffs available. As you can see here, there are numerous feedstuffs from grains to roughages, pellets, and hay available, and the figures. So we've got the price. Obviously these prices are probably quite low and need to be updated, but I'll show you how we can update those as we progress, given prices are quite fluctuating from year to year and within years. So there's your price, your dry matter. So we're all aware that feeds have a percentage of dry matter and a percentage of moisture, and that will vary from feed to feed. So with grains, probably closer to 90% dry matter and 10% moisture, and your hays, you know, 80, 85% dry matter and, you know, 15% moisture. We can put a limit on how much a feed can be incorporated into a ration. So something like canola meal, there's a limit there of 20%. So if you start incorporating canola meal 30% or above, that can start limiting feed intake as a factor of the feed. So that's something quite unique there. So there are functions in there to limit the amount of feed that of a specific feed type that goes in. Energy, expressed as megajoules per kilogram of dry matter or metabolizable energy. That's represented there in that column. RDP and UDP, for a lot of producers, that would not be a familiar term. And what that is how the protein is broken up. So protein is often expressed as crude protein, and I'll show you a bit later in this program, if you do have a crude protein figure, how this program will split the RDP and UDP based on a crude protein figure. UDP, so the rumen, I guess, just to give you a bit of background on protein, I think is probably needed so you get an understanding what RDP and UDP actually are. Is that the rumen microbes require protein as well as energy to live and grow. And the bugs ferment the feed to get the energy and the protein. And the feed passes, some feed passes through the rumen, and with that some rumen microbes. And this is largely where the protein source for ruminants comes from, is through microbial, what they call microbial protein. So RDP is the protein in the food that is eaten by the animals and used by the rumen microbes. Rumen degradable protein, RDP, and undegraded dietary protein, or UDP, is the protein in the food that is not broken down by the rumen bacteria, but it's absorbed further along the intestinal tract. And a lot of people refer to this as bypass protein. So that's the two fractions there. But this program, most feed test reports, and look, depending on what feed test company you use, there's many out there which report things quite differently, will depend on what information you may get to plug in. But most feed test reports are going to report protein in CP or crude protein. The fibre component here, so there's different ways of measuring fibre, NDF, neutral detergent fibre, ADF, acid detergent fibre. This one here is an ADF figure, which they are using in this program to calculate digestibility, particularly where digestibility has not been a robust figure for certain feeds. And then we have calcium, phosphorus, and sodium here as well, and what feed type. If we close that screen and we look at or before we go into that, modifying feed stuff. So we can modify any of these feed stuffs here. So I might just pick on oats here for a moment. You may have a feed analysis on your oats that you may want to change this. Generally, the grains aren't going to have the wide variance in protein and energy, and it's going to be more of your roughage sources, particularly your hays, where management factors and how that when that hay was cut in particular is going to have a large impact on quality. In this portion here, you can adjust your feed prices if you don't want to do that in this component here. When you're building your ration, you'll still have the option to adjust your feed prices so you can get an accurate feed budget at the end of it. So if we close that, and say I wanted to add a feed test, I didn't want to modify one that was in there, I can go through and put in my own figures here. And I'll give you a reminder here for the fibre, you need to put in an ADF figure. Not all feed tests will give you these, but there's some pretty handy resources online, one of them being Feedipedia, so you can Google Feedipedia. It's an encyclopedia, like an online encyclopedia of all animal feeds, any animal feed you can think of. That can give you some really great base values to put in here. If you do have a feed test, these figures here may also be reported. So just referring to the crude protein percent. So as I said, most feed test figures will have a report protein as crude protein. So you can put that figure in here. So you might have 20. And we can say that it is a pulse. So you've got different feeds here, and then that will give you a protein degradability there and calculate it for you. That's what most people are going to have to do, because most feed test reports aren't going to report RDP and UDP. So the fibre, if you don't have an ADF figure, which can be quite likely, but you have an NDF figure, this will give you some base figures on, depending on what feed type, how to convert an NDF figure to an ADF figure. So that's quite a useful calculation. Most feed tests will report an NDF figure, but perhaps not an ADF figure in all circumstances. So if we close that and we move on to the animals. So as I said at the start of this webinar, this program can do both sheep and cattle. And I think for this example, we'll look at sheep. You can put in your breed type in there, covers most breeds, or it has other there if you're running some alternate type breeds. Or maybe I'll just show the cattle here as well. So it doesn't have all breeds in there, something like Speckled Park perhaps, which is one of the newer breeds that come out. You might just put other beef in there, but it's got a lot of the common breeds in there. But for this example, go back to a sheep example, and we might do an SA Merino, and we might be looking at this point to maintain some ewes, and they are adults. So as you can see there, you can put the class of animal in. So the requirements for a weaner versus an adult are going to be quite different, particularly, weaners having a higher protein and ME requirement for growth. So if we put adults in there, and we can do different target feeding strategies here. I think in this state, a lot of people might be pulling rams out now, or we're looking at early pregnant type ewes. So we might, for this example, look at a pregnancy example. We then it takes you to this screen here, where you can vary your target live weight up to 90 kilos, which is quite a large ewe, but we do have some large, particularly crossies, getting around ewes these days. But for my merino example, I'm going to use a 60 kilo merino ewe. You can also, as I said before earlier on, this program doesn't account for condition score, but it does have a growth rate figure in there. So this might be the figure here that you play with if you decide that your ewes too light. But I guess if we're looking at early pregnancy, it may be too late too. But this is perhaps a figure that you could use to improve condition score of those ewes if they weren't on target. But given if they were already pregnant, this is going to be a difficult thing to get them up to the ideal condition score. But anyway, there is a factor in there to increase growth rate. Got a days to conception, and I guess it's quite important that perhaps at an absolute minimum, you had a early to mid pregnancy type ration that you would do in here, and then certainly a late pregnancy, given the nutritional considerations of those two classes would be quite different. There is a function back on the other screen where we could look at a ewe and lamb unit, which would account for the lamb as well. So, or if we targeted weaners, we could target a growth or maintenance. But in this example, just to keep it relevant and timely, we might do an early pregnancy, so 50 days, with the average gestation of a sheep normally about 152 days. But biology being biology, we can be a bit of give and take each side depending on the individual animal there. So, but as a base figure, I'm going to do 50 days as an early pregnancy. We then come to where we can start to prepare the ration, and we've got two options here. So fully supplied, which would be perhaps a sacrifice paddock or confinement feeding where no other pasture was available. There is a function here for supplementary feeding, and we can look at what contribution the paddock may be providing. So this is quite difficult and I guess limiting in the fact that producers will need to have a good handle on how much a sheep their sheep are consuming or obtaining from the paddock, and so you have to make a guess on whether on what that is, from anywhere between 30 and 70%. So having a good handle on how to estimate dry matter in the paddock is really, really important and probably limiting in this factor. It has got some default figures here for different pastures and stubbles, so you can use this to have a guess at where that dry base may be at. So being mindful, things like stubbles can vary quite quickly, and there is a significant grain component to those, and often, you know, stubble, they can go from quite a high quality stubble to a low quality stubble depending on stocking rate, etc. So quite complex, and we've got things like feeding behaviour, and a lot of you producers would know you could have a standing amount of dry feed out there, but it does not necessarily mean they're going to consume every single stalk. So there's those sorts of limitations. And supplementary feeding, we can get what we call substitution. So instead of consuming dry pasture, they end up consuming more supplementary feed, which perhaps would just extend the dry feed availability in your paddock. So best estimates there. If you need some help, seek some further advice on dry feed, pasture availability and quality. For this example, we're going to look at a fully supplied ration and assume these animals are in some kind of containment. So there's various feeds here. So back at the feed stuff screen, if you had your own feeds that you wanted to put in there, you've hopefully put them in there, and you can code them and call them what you like. So you could pick those up in here and start to build your ration. For this example, I will use some barley, which is quite a common feed stuff. I'm going to probably look at there's a lot of straw getting around. There's been a lot of straw donated. So I might look at some barley straw here and see what we can do with that. So it's giving me a suggested energy density for the ration of 11.2 megajoules per kg of dry matter. In here, if it's donated, it probably hasn't cost you anything. But look, certainly if you've had to purchase feed you can look at adjusting those feed prices. So obviously $190 per tonne for barley is quite cheap at the moment. So we might put that up somewhere around, let's say $270. So there, and barley straw, well, that's probably not too far off the pace there, depending on the quality. That one's probably not too bad. So what I was saying, we could adjust the price of or the value of feeds back in the feedstuffs, but we can also do it here as we're building our ration. We can also adjust feed limits. So again, unless you're quite confident and have a good sound nutritional basis, you know, I'd be reluctant to play with these figures too much. Perhaps if you're not sort of quite familiar with what you're actually adjusting here. Otherwise, you could seek some advice, but you can adjust feed limits in that. So this one here is giving me also a maximum amount of grain allowed in the ration. The higher the amount of the grain, the higher the risk of acidosis. There are people in underfeed or production situations where may push this grain figure to 90%. I guess 75 is considered a little bit more safer, and probably closer to 50% is even safer. So the less grain, obviously, the safer it is. But again, unless you have a fine-tuned system, you're very familiar and experienced with feeding grain, be careful about adjusting the maximum of grain allowed in a ration, or seek further advice. Just a quick one here on urea. Urea is a non-protein nitrogen or protein source. So quite a useful thing to include if your rumen degradable protein is limiting and energy is not. If you've got energy limiting in the ration, just using urea alone to try and bump up the rumen degradable protein probably is not going to be that useful, as the micro population in the rumen is going to be suffering anyway, and that needs to be functioning really well for urea to be utilised. But you can have a function there to include urea. Be mindful that urea, if you're not experienced again with feeding, and it's not mixed thoroughly through the ration, or too much is put in, toxicities can easily occur, like ammonia toxicities can easily occur, and often they can be just not adding too much, but often by not mixing it thoroughly through the ration. So then certain animals, when it's fed out, are getting a massive hit urea and then keel over with ammonia toxicity. So just be mindful if you do click that button there. So if we get back to our ration there, we can also, I'll just look at the animal requirements for the target group I'm feeding. So that'll bring that up there for you. If I click formulate the ration, now it's done a sound, as you could probably all hear there. That's one of the inbuilt systems I was talking about earlier, that will put in a warning there that you haven't got enough, it's not balanced, and you're not meeting requirements there. So that's saying I don't have enough energy and I don't have enough rumen degradable protein. So two things there, and it gives me some suggestions of how I can change that. So I could add a legume grain in there. I could try lowering my energy. I'd be reluctant to do that. That means that I'm not going to be meeting my energy requirements on there. Or, as I said to you before, we could look at adjusting the limits of feed. So, for example, I could probably look at increasing this if I had a really good system. I'm quite familiar with feeding a grain. Or I think one of the things we could look at would be to incorporate a legume grain into that. So if I can find my lupins, closer to the top, there they are, and formulate the ration, you'll see there that the lupins have fixed the energy and the protein deficit that I had for that group of animals. So it has incorporated some lime there. So what it will do, we will try to balance for calcium, phosphorus, and sodium. And given a lot of high grain cereal based rations will be high in phosphorus, low in calcium, it'll want to put lime in for most high grain rations, cereal grain rations, and salt as well. Again, just to refer to what I said at the start, make sure that you've tested your water, particularly for salt. There's a lot of stock water sources now that are really high in sodium, and adding additional grain, additional salt to the ration can be quite detrimental. In this case, it hasn't added salt and said there's enough salt in the ration, but if you had a lot of cereal grain in the ration, that may change, and I want to add some salt. So again, remember about your water sources. So in this, it's calculated my ration on a per head per day. I can come over here and have a look at and enter how many animals I'm going to feed. So I'll put 300 in here. So you could have whatever number that might be, depending on your pen size or depending on the amount of animals that you're feeding. And how many days you're going to feed for here. So it might be 60 days. In this case, we've done early pregnancy. So I probably only want to do my early to mid pregnancy. So they're 50 days pregnant now. I only might want to feed them for 30 days at the parameters I've set back for the animals for that. It'll give me a roughage to grain ratio. So this is reasonably safe here. I still probably would incorporate a buffer, and this is where, again, the limitations of the program, not putting a buffer in, I would still like to see a buffer in a 70-30 grain type ration. It'll graph it for those of you that like visual things. It'll pop it into a graph there for you. You can look at the nutrient balances. It'll tell you what's balanced and what's in surplus, so what your requirements and what is actually being supplied. It'll give you a grain introductory schedule there. So that's not accounted for in the feed budget, just to be mindful of that. But there is a grain introductory schedule there, which is quite, I think, conservative, and probably there's a lot of people that do it a lot quicker than that, but that's quite a safe type introductory schedule there. And most importantly here, you will get a ration or a feed budget, basically your ration sheet and your feed budget. So it'll give you parameters that you've set in here, how many days, your live weight, targeted ME of the ration, what's in it, so your cost per tonne here, what's supplied, kilograms per head, kilograms per week, and kilograms per mob. So quite handy for doing a feed budget there. What your grain to roughage ratio is, what your cost is, really helpful, particularly in drought situations and long feeding periods where you know you're making the decision. Well, even under a bushfire thing where there might be a long a bushfire situation where there might be a long feeding period, you can start to look at some figures and what it is going to cost you, and can you afford to do that, and are you better to sell those animals rather than feed them, or perhaps look at other options such as adjustment. And so really, I think that's probably the it for the tool. Really simple, easy to use. You know, any questions with the other, you know, regarding minerals or perhaps dry pasture quality, there are advisors around to help you with that. Thanks, Ian.
Thank you for joining us today. Please contact Tiffany Bennett if you have any technical questions. If you would like a copy of Ration Book, please contact us via the Sheep Connect SA webpage. Thank you for listening to this webinar.